Hey everybody, welcome to episode 4 of the CSA West Michigan Educational Series. Today we have Anthony Coggins from AZURE, who is going to discuss the Sensible Office 365 security controls with us. Good morning, Anthony. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Morning, guys. Thanks
We
for
have
being
Matt here as well. Yeah. All right, let's jump into it.
All right. So as Lloyd mentioned, we're going to be going over Office 365 security controls. This presentation was inspired just by previous professional experience and running into organizations who believe that they're in the cloud, so they must be secure. And while the cloud increases, our resiliency and also increases availability, it also increases exposure. So
I think we have to use that Inigo Montoya one.
Yeah, we do.
That's one of our logos. That's great.
That was a good one.
So here's an example of the problem. So this tool is now deprecated, but previously you were able to enumerate Office 365 users using this really nice Python script written by our friends at Grimm. So this would make it easier for a threat actor to identify any accounts for password spraying. And password spraying Office 365 tenants is still popular today.
So has there been something that's replaced this? I mean, I'm guessing that Microsoft
patched. So this was previously a bug that the community frankly raged about for quite some time. They did, I believe, late last year finally fix the bug. But previously you were able to run this script and enumerate any users in your tenant.
Yeah. As I always joke that as soon as we build a better mousetrap, they build a better mouse. So I'm sure somebody is working on that new and better mouse.
So a quick disclaimer before we get into any advice is all these controls are given as is. This is based on my past experience. It does not necessarily represent AZURE or anything that we are currently doing. So we have a problem. What are we going to do about it? So we're going to talk about 3 categories of control: Azure, Exchange, and Office 365 Security Center that you can tweak and configure to dramatically, in my professional opinion, dramatically increase your security posture. Before we look at these controls, some assumptions we're going to make is that you have an M365 E3 license or higher, and you have Azure P1 or higher. Unfortunately, with Office 365, it's pay to play, or rather pay to be secure. So you need a certain level of licensing, unfortunately, to enact some of these controls. So the Azure controls we're going to go over, a couple of conditional access policies, where to find and configure your password policies, as well as lockout policies, and how to receive a risk user report for your review.
And this is all stuff that is built in, right? There's nothing out. I mean, outside of having those licenses, this is all part of your
to download or purchase.
Okay, great.
So the first conditional access policy we're going to talk about, and if you don't know how to get to this pane, when you log into the Office 365 admin portal, you're going to choose Azure AD at the bottom of the page and go to the Azure AD conditional access. There you can create policies. So this is one of the policies that I highly, highly recommend, and I believe is the most effective of anything I'm going to show you today. So this allows for geo-blocking locations where your business doesn't have a physical or virtual presence. So you can create categories, or not categories. You can create named locations where your business doesn't have a presence. So we recommend blocking countries such as Russia, China, Iran, your high ATP countries, as well as Nigeria, and if you're able to, all of Africa, as most businesses, especially in the West Michigan area, don't have much business in Africa. Ideally, you would include any country that you don't have presence in. That way you have full coverage. But I understand that, people go on vacation, or, maybe you don't want to necessarily block friendly countries, but those are things for you to consider and talk to your business about. So next up is the MFA baseline conditional access policy. There's a couple ways you can enforce MFA, the most popular of which is actually going to the users and then MFA and turning it on for each individual user. That can be a little more granular, but it's easy to miss new users or just anybody in general.
Yeah,
So,
MFA is one that I really like to get on top of, especially if you've decided with your 365 implementation to kind of wall it and bring the cloud down to the ground, if you will.
absolutely.
There's a tendency to forget that those tenant administrators, which are Azure Active Directory accounts, especially if you're running in a hybrid mode, to not have MFA enabled on those. And it's extremely important on those tenant administrative accounts to have MFA enabled at a minimum there. But you definitely want it for anybody that's doing any sort of external authentication. So if you've got conditional access policies in place and you're allowing people to authenticate externally, make sure you've got that MFA turned on for them as well.
And if we think back to remember our very first event last year in the great blizzard of 2019, when we had the FBI folks in, and they said that while it's not foolproof, anytime they have ever done any sort of research into an event that had happened, there was always a lack of MFA, right? So that was the first thing that they look for when there's been any sort of a breach. And so I think that talks to the importance of getting this stuff configured.
Right. You just need to make it annoying for the threat actor, the hacker. There's enough unsecure accounts out there. There's enough, organizations not following any controls that if they run into problems or it takes them too much effort, most of them are just going to move on because they don't want to deal with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the tricky part that comes in with MFA too that I found is that if you're doing any sort of, let's say you're doing a tenant migration, or you've got to do any sort of work that requires a script, using PowerShell scripts, they haven't designed the scripting language to accommodate MFA very well. And because of the way that it times out and you have to re-authenticate, it can really be disruptive if you're trying to do administrative work like a tenant migration. So in those cases, you need to be really careful and start using other tools, doing behavioral analytics, using that conditional access, geo-blocking, because you're not going to be able to use MFA in all of those cases. So you've really got to be smart about how you manage your MFA settings and when you're enabling and disabling them to get work done.
Right. Make sure your exclusions are set up correctly so that, any service accounts have, very strong passwords, 64 characters if you can, but without MFA because they're not able to run without. So,
yep.
Good point.
Yep, good stuff.
Here's another big one. Office 365 supports or uses something called modern authentication. And you've probably seen this when signing into any app recently. You're going to get an external window pop up that actually shows your Office 365 login page. So you can log in a little more securely using that. This conditional access policy is a little more touchy, and you're going to want to approach this one with more caution, as there are going to be things that use legacy authentication. And if you are already in the throes of using Office 365, if you block or turn off legacy authentication, any application that has already set up to be using that is going to break. So things like in the past run into like the Apple Mail app. It has the capability to use modern authentication, but if it originally used legacy auth when logging in, it's going to break and you'll have to sign out and sign back in. So this is something to take a little more phased or cautious approach, but this will tremendously help with password spraying, as password spraying doesn't work on modern authentication clients. Another area that gets overlooked is the password protection policy in Azure Active Directory. Make sure you look at this. honestly, the recommendation is just to mirror what you have on-prem that you have set in your GPO for those lockout thresholds. But there's a lot of times this is overlooked and they're not set correctly, so that, you know, if your accounts are getting sprayed, it's more effective than if you have it set a little more strenuously.
Do either of you guys have a recommendation there? I know, like on the screen, it's set to 5 and 60 seconds. Is that, I mean, I think that's standard. Is that, would that be recommended? Let's even take that on-prem. Do either of the two of you have a recommendation on-prem and in the cloud for what those should be set at?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, you're going to want to talk to your business leaders about what they think makes sense, but you know, anywhere from 3 to 5 is usually what I recommend, and then the lockout is honestly up to you, just enough to deter any external threats from, you know, doing any effective brute forcing.
Yeah, it's definitely a business conversation balance, because they're going to want it, of course, to be, you know, the worst from a security best practice perspective, because it's the most convenient for them. But if you go too far restricted, then you get a lot of pushback and a lot of, you know, just people kind of going, whoa, what the heck here? So yeah, I'd agree with you, Anthony. I think that's about where it should fall. And then it's just a conversation to help the business understand, like, the longer you go out on this, the more risky you're going to get.
Yep.
Always recommended to have on-prem and cloud be the same. Is that?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, that we just have continuity there, so that your employees and your end users, you know, have the same experience in both locations.
Yeah, good.
This goes to the same conversation, but it's something that's overlooked in your MFA lockout. So that if you do have a correct password acceptance, but you know, the MFA is either denied by the employee or end user, or is ignored, you know, what lockout do you want for that as well? So in this one, you probably want a little lower, just because, you know, if they're hitting this lockout, that means the password is successful. So 2 to 3 is probably the recommended for that.
Mm-hmm. With that E3 license, do you get the multi-fact, like Microsoft's MFA with that, correct?
Correct.
So you can do full MFA as long as you have that licensing.
Yeah. So next up is the risky user report. If you look on the screenshot, under the report section, you can look at these live at any time, but we're all busy people, and if you're a IT shop of one, you know, maybe you don't have time every day to look at this. So subscribe to the digest. It'll send you an email weekly to give you any impossible travels, any weird or unusual sign-ins that you'll want to review as possible compromises.
And if you do nothing else, at least use these for your tenant administrators. If you're not going to watch it on any of your other accounts, pay attention to what your global admin's doing, what your SharePoint admin's doing as far as sign-in behavior goes. You want to make sure that they're not coming from some strange place you didn't expect, like you said, the impossible travel. So it's real important to keep on top of those accounts.
So that was it for Azure controls. Next, we're going to talk Exchange controls. A couple common ones are the external email markups, secure email setup, and blocking basic authentication on the Exchange side. So this is a common practice. Many of your organizations maybe have this in place, but if you have another spam filter or another service doing this, you can translate this into Office 365 if you so choose. So in order to do this, you would create a mail flow rule, as you can see in the screenshot. It appends a disclaimer, and luckily that disclaimer accepts HTML. So a lot of organizations will complain about this because, you know, it looks real ugly at the top of the email in big black bold letters. Senders outside the organization. You can pretty it up, as you see to the right there. The HTML code puts a nice red and pink header at the top to let your employees know that an email came from outside the organization, so that they can practice a little more safer email controls as far as clicking here on links or attachments.
So Anthony, with that recipient markup, does it take into account any DMARC, DKIM, SPF policy frameworks there, or is it just purely looking at whatever the domain says, so it can't tell if the you know, the envelope's been forged or if the sender's been forged? I'm assuming without those policies, it's just applying it based on that domain.
Yeah, so it is smart enough to recognize anything quote unquote outside the organization. So if it didn't originate from within Exchange Online or your hybrid Exchange, it will apply this markup. So if somebody does spoof your domain, this will get marked up as well.
Okay, excellent.
Okay. You taking notes on some of this, Lloyd?
I do have my pencil here. I'm writing a few things down. So it's kind of
Next
important.
up is secure email setup. So this is another mail flow rule. As a business practice, you know, there are times where your employees do have to send sensitive information outside of your organization. You know, we hate to see it as InfoSec individuals, but sometimes it has to happen. So we need to be able to give them a secure mechanism to do so. So what this rule does is you set the trigger. So if you see on the second line there, if the subject or body matches, and in our organization we use pound. So if the subject or body has pound in it, it's going to encrypt this message outward to the recipient. Now on the recipient side, they'll receive an email saying you've received a secure email from, you know, the sender. And the requirement to open that email is they have to have a Microsoft or Office 365 account, and it has to match the email address that the recipient or that the sender put in the send address. So, and this can apply to, you know, any email address. You don't have to have an Office 365 account. If you are on-prem Exchange, G Suite, you can sign up for a free Microsoft account and open and respond to this email.
I get frequent questions a lot how to do the secure email as far as from the user perspective when they go to send the email. And very early on in my career, I didn't realize that those flags, when you apply those rules, like you used the pound here, could be just about anything you want. So, you know, I've noticed there's a lot of variance in organizations on what they use. So
absolutely, I've seen
users,
star secure star, you know,
yeah,
secure in all caps.
It's all over.
Yeah.
So yeah, just important to note, make sure you educate your users on what your secure email tags are and when to use them.
So we talked earlier about blocking basic authentication using a conditional access rule that does apply to Exchange, but I like multiple facets of control. Or if you just want to apply it to Exchange, you can create an authentication policy within PowerShell to block basic authentication through Exchange Online. So again, approach this with caution. There needs to be a larger discussion around this practice, but is something you should definitely have the discussion around. Finally, we're going to talk about Office 365 Security Center controls. So that's going to include creating an alert for new inbox rules, making sure your e-discovery permissions are set correctly, and your threat management policies are reviewed and set appropriately. So this is probably one of my favorite rules, and that's creating an alert anytime you have a new inbox rule in your tenant. So just from doing forensic investigations, and you may have noticed this in the past yourselves, but a popular method for data exfil and a very common indicator of compromise are inbox rules. So your threat actors will frequently, when they take over an account, create an inbox rule to have any message sent to the RSS folder for a domain that they're maybe trying to get a wire fraud, transfer done on, or simply exfilling all email that comes into an external email address. And so that can cause, just havoc for anybody. So to review these rules is something that, I think is super important. If you're initially just getting into Office 365, this rule can be a little spammy as people get their email clients set up. But this typically dies down. Even we're power users ourselves. How often do you honestly create inbox rules? So this is something that you or your SOC team should be reviewing as they come in.
And you could always create a rule to have the spammy alerts go somewhere.
Exactly.
And alerted that you
then get an alert on that rule.
Alert.
This is another important one, making sure your eDiscovery permissions are set correctly. So with Office 365, you thankfully have the ability to do things like content searches, email purges, and eDiscovery investigations when an incident occurs, or you just need to do some deep diving on your tenant. So you want to make sure that the eDiscovery manager permission is set, or else you're going to run into frustrations when you're running content searches or trying to do anything else in the Security and Compliance Center. And this, I've personally seen this take a little bit to propagate. So when you set this permission, it doesn't always take effect immediately. So you're going to want to make sure that this is set appropriately so that you don't run into any hiccups when you are running investigations. And finally, you're going to want to make sure your threat management policies are all configured appropriately and honestly just reviewed, because a lot of these aren't set at all or aren't set very well out of the box. So just to go over each of these lightly, the anti-phishing policies are great for protecting against spoofing, especially display name spoofing. So somebody sends an email as your CEO at a different domain. The anti-phishing policies you can set to catch and block those. Anti-spam policies, we're all familiar with spam. Just make sure that's set appropriately. There's a nice section in there for international spam and language spam. So again, if you don't have business in Russia or you're not getting emails in Russian, you can set those to go right to spam. Enhanced filtering and DKIM are things that you want to dive into a little more on your own. I can't really give you, recommendations on the enhanced filtering, as that's something that's a little more granular as far as tweaking to things that you may run into as false positives and things of that nature. DKIM and DMARC are things that you should probably just have. They're a lot easier to set up than a lot of people think. There are great guides out there, and Office 365 makes it pretty easy to just turn it on. If you're hosting your domain with Office 365, they can do it for you. If you're not, they'll generate the keys, just copy and paste that into your DNS provider and flip the switch in that policy to enable DKIM, and then make sure your DMARC policy is set appropriately for your organization.
And with that one too, if you're using any sort of bulk mailing provider for marketing or advertising campaigns, as we found out recently, Matt, having those records set will be very helpful to ensure that if you're using that service, it doesn't end up in people's spam boxes instead of their inbox. So yeah, there is a little bit extra setup there if you're not hosting it, like you said, in 365. You got to make sure you get those records in there. They do make it pretty easy. The guides are great. We just recently did it. I think it was this week, Matt. We got it all turned on. So yeah, it's very helpful. I definitely recommend having those set up for your domain.
Yeah, the next set of emails that I sent out, I got several people that responded that it was no longer in their spam box, but they were getting it in their actual inbox. Look for a further discussion in one of these next week sometime. Lloyd, I'll talk to you about that later.
Yeah, for sure.
Continuing on, your anti-malware policy is something that is quite easy to set up and can help with your your employees and end users receiving attachments that they shouldn't. So with Office 365, including a subscription to OneDrive, there's no reason your employees should be sending or receiving files such as zip files, executables, RARs, raw PHP code, things of that nature. Use OneDrive for sending that. There's no reason you should be getting that over email. So in here, you can block specific file extensions like 7-zip, zip, things we just discussed. So
if you want to watch an Exchange administrator lose his mind, during a pandemic when everybody starts trying to email internally files to each other instead of using OneDrive, their heads explode. Just don't. Just use the internal sharing controls in OneDrive, please. Why can't I send a 25 meg attachment? Because you should be sharing it through OneDrive.
And the last one is actually, I believe, a recent addition, as I wasn't aware of this in my previous organization. But you can actually set up what your user submission mailbox is in Office 365 so that you can review any phishing messages, and those can actually automatically be uploaded to Office as well to, help their algorithm and, maybe do some auto purging themselves. So always a good thing to have if you don't employ another service like KnowBe4 or, Proofpoint or another spam filter that you can submit these possibly malicious emails to.
Now, if you have a server like a Proofpoint service or system running, does it work side by side with some of?
It will work in lieu with that. Yeah. So you can set the same. You can set the same mailbox, and it will also just monitor that as well. So maybe use it as a double-edged sword kind of thing.
Yeah. Yep. Sounds good.
All right, that is all I had. I do have links for supporting documentation for all of the controls that I talked about. So we will make sure to include those in the description of the video so that you guys can read the documentation yourselves should you feel the need to hopefully deploy some of these in your organization yourselves.
Excellent. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, as you look through, your 365 implementation, you start talking about your security configuration requirements. It's easy to just go to your security department and say, tell me everything I have to be, compliant to, what are my settings? What are my basic settings? So as you're having these conversations with the business, it's really important to kind of understand what your business use cases are, because that will help define some of what these security settings should be. There's a lot of great best practice out there. I'm sure you can reach out to Matt here. He'll be glad to hook you up with some people that can help you out, or Anthony can answer some questions. I could as well. But just make sure as you're doing this, you don't just go back to your security department and say, what are my settings? Because if you don't tell us what you're trying to do with your implementation, it's difficult for us to answer that question.
Absolutely. So, in any, I like to preach this as often as I can. Don't get stuck in your IT bubble. Make sure you're having discussions with your business around what controls you're about to put in place so that you're not impacting anything mistakenly.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Anthony. It was great talking with you today. This is some great information, and we'll make sure it all gets up on the channel with all the supporting docs. Any other closing thoughts, Matt, before we wrap up here?
Just make sure you like, subscribe, and share. I think that's the YouTube stuff you're supposed to do, right? So
Yes, absolutely. And if you got other topics or anything else you'd like to see us cover, please send them our way, CSA@csawmi.org, and we'll get them up on the channel.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.